Close your eyes for just a moment. Not yet, not quite yet, but almost. Keep them soft and heavy, the way they feel on a late autumn evening when the fire has burned low and the room has gone warm and amber and still. Now imagine the sound of water. Not crashing, not roaring, simply moving. The slow, patient breathing of the Atlantic Ocean as it rolls against a granite shoreline somewhere far up the coast of New England, where the pines grow sideways from the wind and the air tastes of salt and cold iron and something older than memory. There is a tower there. It rises from a low, weathered hill, white-painted stone, though the paint has gone soft and ivory with age, stained at the base by decades of sea spray and moss and the gentle green exhale of a coast that never entirely sleeps. The tower is not tall by any grand measure, and yet it stands above everything for miles, above the fishing shacks, above the spruce trees, above the grey-green chop of the harbour. And at the top of that tower, wrapped in glass and brass and the warm breath of burning oil, there is a light. It turns, slowly, faithfully, the way a heartbeat turns the minutes of a life into something whole and continuous and quietly beautiful. We are going there now. Come gently. There is nothing to fear here. Only history, breathing softly, waiting to be remembered. Before we step across the threshold of this story, before we climb the worn iron stairs and feel the cold brass of the railing beneath our fingers, there is something soft and small I would like to ask of you. If you have found your way here, this quiet corner of the evening, this slow and gentle telling of a life lived by lantern light and ocean wind, then, perhaps, this is precisely the kind of place you have been looking for without quite knowing it. We make these stories with great care. Each word is chosen the way a lighthouse keeper once chose the wick for his lamp, deliberately, slowly, with full attention to the quality of the light it will cast. We wander through old harbour records and yellowed logbooks and the faded correspondence of men and women who lived their entire lives within the sound of the sea. And then we bring those lives here, to you, so that history might become something you can rest inside of rather than merely read about. If that sounds like something you would like more of, more slow evenings, more forgotten centuries, more rooms lit by firelight and filled with the scent of wood smoke and brine, then consider subscribing. It costs nothing but a single gentle tap. And now we may begin. The year is somewhere deep in the 19th century. The coast of Maine is iron grey and beautiful. Lighthouse keeper is waking before dawn. Let us go to him. To understand the life of a 19th century New England lighthouse keeper, one must first understand the land that shaped him, and more precisely, the particular texture of that land, where it meets the sea and ceases to be land at all, dissolving instead into something ambiguous and grey and perpetually in motion. The coast of Maine, the years between 1820 and 1880, was not a gentle thing. It was not the kind of coastline one finds in paintings hung in drawing rooms, soft dunes and warm surf and children running with their shoes off. This was a coast of granite and consequence, coast of barnacled ledges that waited beneath the water's surface like the backs of sleeping giants, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the wooden hulls that passed above them. Coast of deep cold harbours where the fog did not merely drift but settled, deliberately, densely, as though it intended to stay for weeks, which sometimes it did. The trees along the shore grew in the shape of their suffering, bent permanently inland by the prevailing Atlantic winds, their roots gripping the thin soil with a tenacity that seemed almost willful, almost desperate, though they understood at some cellular level that letting go would mean the end of everything. The light on the water, even on clear days, had a quality unlike any other. It came in low and silver in the mornings, washing everything in a cool, pewter-toned luminescence that made the fishing boats in the harbour look like brushstrokes in an unfinished painting. By afternoon, if the clouds permitted, the light turned briefly golden, a rich amber warmth. that transformed the grey rocks into something almost Mediterranean, something almost warm before the evening came and drained the colour from everything again, leaving the world blue and then purple and then the deep, particular darkness of a coastline that has not yet learned about electricity. And it was into this world, this specific and demanding and beautiful world, that the lighthouse keeper was born. Not always literally born here, of course. Some keepers were appointed by the government and arrived from inland towns, carrying their confusion about the tides in their eyes like a man who has just learned a new language and is not yet certain he has the grammar right. Others came from fishing families, men who had grown up reading the water the way their mothers read scripture, fluently, with deep feeling and with a respectful wariness of the passages that promised suffering. But regardless of where he came from, the coast remade him. It always did. The salt air entered his lungs and stayed there. The sound of the surf entered his sleeping and never entirely departed. The fog entered his sense of time and softened it, rounded off its sharp edges, taught him that precision was a human ambition that the Atlantic Ocean did not share. The particular stretch of coast where our keeper lived and worked was, by most practical measurements, quite small. Few acres of rocky headland jutting into the Gulf of Maine, where the water was so cold that even in August it had the temperature of deep intention, of something that had travelled a very long distance and had not warmed along the way. The headland was connected to the mainland by a narrow neck of land, just wide enough for a cart track, flanked on either side by the sea, so that on windy days the spray crossed from one side to the other and settled on the keeper's coat as he walked back from the village, leaving fine white crystals of salt on the dark wool that his wife would brush off with her hand in the evenings absent-mindedly, the way one brushes away evidence of everywhere a person has been. There was a small cove on the southern face of the headland where the fishermen sometimes sheltered their dories when the weather turned. The cove smelled of brine and old rope and the particular mineral sweetness of low tide, that complex ancient scent that is half ocean and half earth and half something entirely its own. A smell that has no name in English because English developed mostly inland, away from the places where the sea exposes its floor twice a day and lets you look at what lives underneath. Mussels clustered in their blue-black thousands on the rocks at the waterline, their shells faintly iridescent in the afternoon light. Periwinkles traced their slow, deliberate journeys across the exposed stone. Green and amber strands of kelp draped themselves across the ledges like the discarded ribbons of some enormous, indifferent celebration. Farther back from the water's edge, the land rose gently before levelling into the flat, windswept acre on which the lighthouse stood. The grass here was short and dense, and a particular shade of dark green, almost blue in certain lights, the kind of grass that has been pressed flat by 10,000 storms and grown back 10,000 times, and no longer bothers being anything other than exactly what it is. Clover grew among it in summer, and the keeper's children, when he had them, would lie in it on warm afternoons, pressing their faces into its dense, cool surface, smelling the earth and the salt and the sweetness of the clover blossoms mixed together into something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives as the olfactory definition of home. In the distance, visible on clear days from the lantern room at the top of the tower, were the other islands, low shapes on the horizon, dark and quiet, fringed with spruce trees that from this distance looked like the teeth of a comb held sideways against the sky. Some of the islands had their own lights. On particularly clear nights, the keeper could see them winking across the water, those distant flames in their distant towers, and he could feel, though he might not have had the words for it, a kind of solidarity, a kind of brotherhood of light stretched across the darkness of the Gulf of Maine. Each keeper at his own post, each lamp turning its faithful circle, together holding open a corridor of safety through which the ships of commerce and necessity moved in their slow, salt-darkened procession from one place to another. This was the world. These were its textures, the roughness of granite under a gloved hand, the soft resistance of wet grass underfoot, the cold silk of sea fog settling on a turned-up collar. These were its sounds, the long exhalation of surf on stone, the dry percussion of rigging against a mast in the harbour, the low conversation of the wind moving through the spruce trees on the hillside above the cove, speaking in a language that sounded almost like something intelligible, almost like something worth understanding, if only you could be quiet enough and patient enough and willing enough to simply stand still and listen. The lighthouse keeper had learnt to listen. It had taken years. It had taken the kind of patience that only a very specific combination of geography and vocation and solitude can produce, but he had learned it. And now, on this grey morning, as the light in the east is just beginning to separate itself from the darkness, just beginning to suggest that it exists at all, he is standing at the top of his tower, with his hand on the cold glass of the lantern room, listening. And the coast is speaking, and the light is still turning. Let us look at the lighthouse now. Not the idea of it, not the symbol of it, though there is plenty of symbolism to be found here, and we will come to it in its own time. Let us look at the physical object itself, the actual structure, its specific dimensions and materials, and the evidence of age that marks its surfaces, the way age marks every surface it is, given enough time to touch. The tower is built of granite, locally quarried granite, cut from the same ledges that rise from the sea floor offshore, which means that the lighthouse and the hazards it protects against are made of precisely the same material. There is something in this that rewards a moment of quiet contemplation. The rock that would have torn a ship's hull open has been cut and fitted and mortared into the shape of a warning. The very danger has been transformed by human hands and human intention into the instrument of safety. This is the kind of irony that the 19th century did not always pause to appreciate, being a century generally more interested in the practical than the philosophical, but it is there regardless, built into the walls as surely as the mortar. The stones of the tower are roughly cut on their outer faces, but fitted with extraordinary precision where they join one another, running a finger along one of these joints, and there are keepers who did this habitually in the way that some people run their fingers along the spines of books. One feels almost no gap at all. The stone fits against stone with a closeness that speaks to the skill of the masons who built it, and to the understanding that the sea is not forgiving of gaps, of spaces, of any invitation to enter that is not firmly refused. The builder of a lighthouse understands this at a level beyond the theoretical. He has seen what the sea does when it finds a weakness. He builds accordingly. The exterior of the tower has been whitewashed. This was standard practice required by the Lighthouse Board, which understood that visibility in daylight was as important as the lamp's visibility at night. A white tower against a dark headland could be seen by a navigator miles out at sea and used as a daymark, a fixed, reliable reference point by which to determine position before the darkness came and the lamp took over the work of guidance. The whitewash was applied annually, usually in the spring when the worst of the winter storms had passed and the walls had dried sufficiently to accept a new coat. The keeper applied it himself, climbing a wooden ladder propped against the curve of the tower, working section by section, the thick lime mixture going on chalky white and then settling as it dried into a creamy, slightly luminous finish that caught even the dull light of overcast days and held it, giving the tower its characteristic glow. By autumn the whitewash had aged. The lower portions of the tower, the sections most exposed to spray and weather, had taken on a greenish cast where algae had begun their patient colonization of the damp stone. At the base, where the rock met the thin soil of the headland, a fringe of moss had established itself over the years into a dense, velvety border of deep green, soft as a brush against the fingers, holding moisture long after the surrounding ground had dried, trellising it slowly as the days warmed into a faint, cool, earthy exhalation that mingled with the salt air and became part of the particular composite scent of the place. The door at the base of the tower was made of wood, heavy iron-banded oak, its surface weathered to a silver grey that matched the granite on overcast days so completely that the door seemed almost to disappear, becoming simply a slightly darker shadow in the wall rather than a distinct object. The iron of the hinges and the large ring latch had oxidized to a deep reddish-brown, not the bright orange rust of neglected iron, but the darker, denser rust of iron that has been tended to without being coddled, oiled occasionally, kept functional, allowed to show its age without being permitted to deteriorate into uselessness. The keeper oiled those hinges on the first Monday of each month. He had done it so many times that the motion had left its trace, a slight darkening of the stone doorframe on the side where his hand rested while he worked, a ghost of oil and soot and the warmth of repeated touch. Inside the door, the tower opened into its true self. The staircase was iron, a tight winding helix that rose through the hollow centre of the tower from the ground floor to the watchroom just below the lantern. The stairs were cast in sections, each section a pie-shaped wedge of grating held by a central column of wrought iron and attached to the outer wall by brackets. The grating was open, one could look through it at the stones below, which the keeper had long since stopped noticing, but which made every first-time visitor step very carefully and press one hand against the curved stone wall. The sound of footsteps on this staircase was a particular kind of music, a dry, metallic ringing that climbed ahead of the climber, arriving at each landing a fraction of a second before the person who had made the sound, so that ascending the lighthouse had always the faint, dreamy quality of following one's own echo into a higher and quieter place. The walls of the stairwell were painted white, or had been painted white at some point. They were now a palimpsest of that whiteness, layered and shadowed and stained by the years of oil smoke and damp, and the occasional candle carried up in a tin lantern when the main lamp was not yet lit. In the lower portions of the stairwell, where the wall was most accessible, there were marks made over the decades. Not graffiti exactly, nothing so deliberate or irreverent, but the accidental record of presence, a smear of lamp black at shoulder height where a keeper had leaned. Date scratched lightly into the plaster, 1847, with no further explanation. Child's handprint in what appeared to be paint, small and starfish-shaped, pressed flat against the wall at a height of perhaps 3 feet from the nearest step, belonging to some keeper's child who had come up the stairs on a slow afternoon and left this small, permanent announcement of themselves. I was here. I was this tall. The wall is cool and smooth, and I am not yet afraid of any of this. The windows in the stairwell were small and deeply recessed, narrow vertical slits in the stone that admitted enough light to navigate by during the day, and through which, at certain angles, the sea was visible in brief, brilliant vertical flashes of grey-green light as one climbed past each one, the ocean appearing and disappearing in these stone-framed glimpses like a thought that keeps returning, patient, persistent, present. Always present. At the top of the staircase the watchroom waited, a small circular chamber just below the lantern, with a low bench around its perimeter and a trapdoor in the ceiling through which the keeper climbed to tend the lamp. This room smelled of brass polish and lamp oil and something older and harder to name, the accumulated breath of decades of nighttime vigils, the residue of all the hours that had been spent here in the particular alertness of duty, waiting and watching and keeping the light alive. Above the watchroom, above the trapdoor and the short iron ladder that connects the world of waiting to the world of light, there is the lantern room. It is by any objective measure a small space, perhaps 8 feet in diameter, circular of course, enclosed on all sides by the large curved panes of the lantern itself. Thick glass set in iron astragals, the glazing bars that divide the lantern into its individual panels. But small as it is, the lantern room has a quality of expansiveness that defies its dimensions. Step through the trapdoor on a clear morning and the world opens around you in every direction. The sea to the east, shimmering and enormous, the harbour to the south, the masts of the fishing boats standing like a bare winter grove against the sky, the dark hills of the mainland to the west, green and rolling and very far away, and to the north the open Atlantic, unobstructed from here to the other side of an ocean, steel blue and immense and entirely indifferent to the smallness of everything on shore. Standing here, one understands immediately why the builders placed the lantern room exactly here. Not just for the practicality of elevation, though that is primary, of course, the simple geometry of light and distance and the curve of the earth making height essential, but because there is something about this vantage point that clarifies the mind. The clutter of land and life falls away below. The horizon presents itself as a clean, continuous line, broken only by the occasional dark shape of a vessel working its way along the coast, and the sky above takes up its full and proper proportion of the world, which is considerably larger than one tends to remember when one is living at sea level. The lantern itself was, throughout most of the 19th century, a thing of increasing sophistication. In the earliest decades of the century, American lighthouses burned whale oil in simple lamps with flat wicks, producing a light that was honest and warm but not particularly powerful. As the century progressed and as the importance of coastal navigation grew along with the commercial shipping industry, the technology improved in ways that the keepers who worked through those decades of change could feel as a kind of increasing responsibility, escalation of the precision required of them, and a corresponding deepening of the consequences of failure. The Fresnel lens, introduced to American lighthouses in the 1830s and 40s, was the great revolution of the age. Named for Augustin Jean Fresnel, the French physicist who conceived it, the lens worked on principles of refraction and magnification that most keepers understood not as optics but as miracle, a flame the size of a clenched fist, burning at the center of a lens that looked like a glass beehive, a series of concentric prisms arranged in a precise and beautiful hierarchy of rings could throw its light 15, 20, even 25 miles across dark water. The prisms gathered the light from every angle and redirected it outward in a single concentrated beam of such intensity that a ship's captain, miles out to sea, could not merely see it but feel it, that warm, rhythmic flash, striking his face from across the darkness and telling him with complete authority exactly where he was. The lens sat on a brass pedestal at the center of the lantern room, turning on a mechanism of clockwork gears and a weighted cable that the keeper wound by hand every few hours throughout the night, the way one winds a clock, a deliberate, rhythmic turning of a crank in the watchroom below that loaded the weights and set the lens once again to its patient rotation. The rate of rotation determined the character of the light. The particular pattern of flashes, so many per minute at such intervals, that identified this lighthouse as distinct from every other lighthouse on the coast. Ships' captains carried charts on which these characteristics were noted, so that a flash seen in the darkness was not merely light but language, not merely warning but greeting, a specific voice calling out from a specific place along the coast, "I am here, I know where you are. Come no closer to my left and you will be safe." The brass of the lens housing and the clockwork mechanism required constant attention. Brass, in a maritime environment, has a powerful inclination toward tarnish. The salt air attacks it continuously, laying down a film of greenish-grey oxidation that, if left unaddressed, would progress from cosmetic unpleasantness to actual degradation of the metal. The keeper polished the brass every morning without exception, working around the lens with a soft cloth and a preparation of rotten stone and oil. His reflection moving in the curved surfaces of the metal as he worked, distorted and multiplied and amber-tinted so that he looked, these brief private moments, like something medieval, a craftsman in a workshop of alchemical tools, surrounded by brass and glass and the lingering smell of the night's lamp oil, turning a tarnished surface back toward brightness by the patient application of human effort. The glass panels of the lantern required cleaning as well. The sea air was never truly clean, it carried in it fine particles of salt and the invisible residue of the ocean's constant motion, and these settled on the glass panels and, over the course of days, built up a film that reduced the lamp's effective range and introduced a faint distortion into the light that the keeper could not bear. A keeper who allowed his glass to go dirty was a keeper who was, by the measure of his profession, failing. The glass was wiped down with a preparation of diluted vinegar applied with a chamois cloth, a soft, pale leather that absorbed the solution without scratching, and then buffed to clarity with a dry cloth in long, circular strokes. The smell of vinegar in the lantern room on cleaning mornings mingled with the brass polish and the lamp oil into a distinctive, complex fragrance that was, for any keeper who worked with these materials for years, inseparable from the feeling of a job done properly, of a night's work set in order. During the day the lamp was extinguished and the lens covered with a heavy curtain, dark fabric, usually a deep blue or green, chosen to protect the lens's optical elements from the concentrated heat that direct sunlight passing through the prisms would generate. The curtain was drawn each morning as part of the keeper's routine and removed each evening before lighting, and this daily rhythm of covering and uncovering, of protecting the light during its period of rest, had a quality of ceremony about it. The keeper handled the curtain carefully, folding it in a particular way and setting it on the shelf beneath the lens in a particular arrangement, and the care he took was not merely professional fastidiousness, it was something more resembling tenderness. The lens was his charge, the light was his responsibility. He handled the curtain the way a parent handles the blanket drawn over a sleeping child, quietly, deliberately, with full attention to the fragile and precious thing it covers. And every evening, when the light in the sky faded to the point where the horizon became difficult to distinguish, when the grey of the water and the grey of the sky began to merge into a single undifferentiated dimness, the keeper climbed to the lantern room, drew back the curtain, trimmed the wick to its precise and proper height, and lit the lamp. And the light began to turn. Attached to the base of the tower, connected to it by a short covered passageway that the family called the neck, without particularly intending the anatomical metaphor, was the keeper's dwelling. In the early decades of the 19th century, this was often a modest, spare structure, a single-story cottage of timber frame construction, clapboard-sided, with a steeply pitched roof designed less for aesthetic appeal than for the practical shedding of snow, which arrived on this coast in quantities that required the roof to be taken seriously, as a structural participant in the winter. As the century progressed and the federal government's investment in its lighthouse system deepened, the responsibility having passed from local authorities to the Treasury Department and eventually to the dedicated bureaucracy of the Lighthouse Board, the keepers' dwellings were improved, expanded and standardized into a more comfortable form that acknowledged, however gradually and bureaucratically, that the people maintaining these vital lights were human beings who needed more than bare functionality from the places they lived. By mid-century, a typical New England lighthouse keeper's dwelling was a story, and a half-cape-style house, a form as native to this coast as the granite itself, its proportions as familiar and as right as the proportion of a well-made sentence. The exterior was clapboard, painted white like the tower, though the paint on the house weathered differently than the paint on the stone, more slowly, more unevenly, lifting first at the joints between boards and at the exposed end grain of the corners, so that by late autumn the house had an appealing, slightly ragged quality, a lived-in imperfection that the pure geometry of the tower beside it did not share. The front of the house faced away from the sea, or rather faced the narrow cart track that connected the headland to the mainland road, the direction from which visitors occasionally arrived and from which supplies were brought. There were 2 windows on either side of the front door, symmetrical in the manner of all Cape houses, each fitted with wooden shutters that could be closed and latched from inside when the storms came. The shutters had seen considerable weather. Their paint was largely gone along their exposed edges, worn back to bare grey wood by the annual insistence of the winter gales, and they hung with the slight forward lean of things that have been pushed against many times and have not quite returned to plumb, but they worked. They latched securely. When the storms came and the shutters were pulled closed, the house went dark and private and sealed, and the sound of the wind and the spray against the wooden panels was a sound the family knew from the inside, muffled, rhythmic, almost reassuring in its familiarity. The front door was painted a dark colour, red in some accounts, dark green in others. The colour varied by the keeper's preference or the availability of pigment at the hardware merchants in the nearest town. Whatever its colour, the door had a small overhang above it, a modest pitched roof on 2 wooden brackets, just wide enough to keep the direct rain off a person standing in the doorway. Beneath this overhang, generations of keepers had hung their oilskin coats on a pair of iron hooks driven into the clapboards, the hooks positioned at exactly the right height for a man of medium build, which many keepers were, so that the coats hung there in a permanent dark tangle of waterproofed canvas, smelling of the sea and the lanolin treatment that kept the fabric supple, swaying slightly in the coastal breeze even on calm days. Inside the front door, the house arranged itself around the central fact of the chimney, a massive brick structure that ran from the cellar to the ridge, serving the kitchen fireplace on the south side and the parlour fireplace on the north, both on the ground floor, and a smaller hearth in the sleeping chamber above. The chimney was the thermal spine of the house, the source and distributor of all warmth, and everything in the floor plan oriented itself toward or around it, with the unconscious deference of things arranged by necessity rather than fashion. The parlour was the room that visitors saw first, and in the 19th century a parlour was understood to be a room that performed a kind of social function. It presented the household to the world, or to whatever limited version of the world reached this remote headland. In a keeper's house, this presentation was modest but sincere. A braided rug on the wide plank floor, its colours faded by years to a harmonious range of rust and cream and dusty blue. 2 chairs upholstered in horsehair fabric, dark and slightly scratchy to the touch, arranged near the fireplace. A small table bearing a lamp, oil of course, a smaller version of the great lamp in the tower, and beside it a stack of reading matter that reflected the keeper's particular interests and the availability of printed material on this stretch of coast: almanacs, navigational publications, a Bible, perhaps a novel or two passed from household to household along the coast in the slow circulation of reading materials that served these remote communities in place of a library. On the walls of the parlour, hung with the careful asymmetry of objects accumulated over time rather than selected all at once, were the artefacts of a life lived at the intersection of domestic order and maritime necessity. A barometer essential, consulted multiple times daily, its round white face and brass fittings polished to the same standard as the lighthouse equipment. Framed print of a naval vessel, perhaps cut from a publication, perhaps a gift, its details a little indistinct from years of coastal damp and the slight film that lamp smoke deposits on all surfaces over time. Sampler embroidered by a wife or daughter, its cross-stitched letters spelling out a verse of scripture or a domestic sentiment in thread the colour of the sea on calm days. The kitchen was the true centre of life. It occupied the larger portion of the ground floor, warm and fragrant and busy in a way the parlour never quite managed to be. The fireplace here was large enough to roast a joint of meat on the crane hooks that swung out over the coals, large enough to accommodate the Dutch oven and the bread peel and the long-handled waffle iron and all the other implements of serious domestic cooking that hung on the iron rack beside the hearth. Their handles darkened by decades of handling, their working surfaces seasoned to a deep, nearly black finish by years of heat and fat and use. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and salt pork, and the dried herbs that hung in bundles from the low-ceiling beams, thyme and sage and rosemary tied with rough twine and suspended in the warmth above the stove, giving off their dry, faintly medicinal fragrance into the air of every meal. The floor of the kitchen was wide pine boards, worn smooth and pale by decades of feet crossing them in the particular patterns of domestic routine. A slightly more worn path from the door to the fireplace, another from the table to the dry sink, another from the corner where the wood was stacked to the hearthstone where it was burned. These worn paths were a kind of autobiography written in the surface of the floor. Here is where we walked most. Here is what mattered to us. Here is the shape of our days made visible. Beyond the walls of the house and the base of the tower, the keeper's world extended across a small but surprisingly varied geography of outbuildings, garden plots, pathways, and the wild, tongue-governed edge where the headland gave way to the sea. The outbuildings came first, those practical structures without which 19th-century domestic life, particularly in a remote location, was simply not possible. There was a woodshed necessarily large, its interior smelling of fresh-cut pine and old bark, and the particular dusty sweetness of sawdust accumulated over many winters. The wood was stacked with care, not the careless pile of someone who regards firewood as merely fuel, but the deliberate, interlocking architecture of a person who understands that how the wood is stacked affects how quickly it dries, and how quickly it dries affects how cleanly it burns. And how cleanly it burns affects how warm the house is in February when the temperature drops to single digits, and the snow comes sideways off the water, and the world contracts to the distance between the house and the woodshed and back again. The keeper stacked his wood in alternating cross-hatched layers, each piece placed with its split face outward to expose the grain to the drying air. The rows as regular as masonry, the whole structure held between 2 upright posts, with the reliable patience of something built to last the winter and then the winter after that. There was a small barn, barely large enough to deserve the name, more properly a large shed, where the keeper kept a cow if the Lighthouse Board's allocation permitted it, or a goat if it did not, and where in any case the chickens established their perpetual society of minor urgencies and quiet clucking. The smell of the barn was the smell of animal warmth and hay and damp earth and the mineral complexity of manure, and it was a smell that stood in absolute contrast to the salt and stone and iron of the coast just 50 yards away. Entering the barn from the open headland was like stepping briefly into another continent, warmer, softer smelling, more forgiving of the nose and the lungs, more domestic in the oldest and most fundamental sense of that word. A root cellar was dug into the hillside behind the house. Its entrance a low wooden door set into the slope, fitted with heavy strap hinges that kept the door sealed tightly against both the cold and the encroachment of animals looking for easier meals than the open coast provided. Inside in the dark and the cool and the persistent smell of earth and old vegetables, the keeper's household stored its reserves against winter, barrels of salt fish, crocks of pickled vegetables, bins of potatoes and turnips and onions, jars of preserves and pickles and canned tomatoes put up by his wife through the long summer afternoons when the kitchen became a laboratory of heat and vinegar and glass. The root cellar was the household's argument against scarcity, the physical embodiment of the understanding that winter here was not a season to be met without preparation, that the months between November and April were a long negotiation between human need and the indifference of the natural world, and that the side with the greater stockpile tended to negotiate from a stronger position. Kitchen garden occupied a sheltered patch on the south side of the house, protected from the worst of the north and west winds by the mass of the building itself. The soil here was thin and rocky. Every spring the keeper turned it over and removed a fresh harvest of stones, which he added to the low wall he had been building along the garden's east edge for as long as he had been here, so that the wall grew slowly taller and longer over the years, incorporating the evidence of each spring's labour in its increasing mass. What grew in this garden was determined less by preference than by the harsh conditions of the site. Hardy root vegetables, of course, turnips, parsnips, beets, which could be pulled before the first hard frost and stored below. Kale and cabbage, which seemed to actively enjoy the cold, their leaves becoming sweeter and more tender after the first frost, as the plants converted their starches to sugars against the coming freeze. Peas in the spring, their tendrils reaching up the rough twine trellis with an optimism that the keeper, watching from the kitchen window, found genuinely moving. Marigolds at the borders, planted partly for their cheerful orange insistence on colour in a landscape that offered mostly grey and green, and partly for the old belief well established among coastal gardeners of the period that their scent discouraged the insects that troubled the vegetables. Pathway of flat stones led from the back door of the house down to the water's edge, not exactly to the water but to the point where the maintained domesticated portion of the headland ended and the wild unworked margin of the coast began. This transition was always visible. On one side of the path's end, the short managed grass of the headland, on the other the increasingly rough and wind-sculpted ground of the cliff edge where the soil was thin over granite bedrock and the vegetation was the tenacious, low-growing plants that had worked out an accommodation with conditions no garden plant would tolerate. Sea rocket and seaside goldenrod, stands of tough, wiry grass, bearberry with its small dark red fruits in autumn, the occasional wild rose with its single-layered pink blossoms gone to hips by October. The cliff edge itself was not dramatic. This was not a coastline of plunging vertical drops and crashing cataracts. It was instead a gradual, irregular descent, the granite ledges stepping down to the water in a series of flat, sea-polished shelves interspersed with areas of tumbled rock where the ledge had fractured, and the sea had over centuries rearranged the pieces into the particular irregular artistry of geological time. At low tide, the exposed rock shelves held their captured pools. Tide pools, those temporary and exquisite aquariums of the intertidal zone, each one a complete world in miniature. The keeper knew every pool on the southern face of the headland. He had watched them for years, and over those years they had become a kind of text to him, a record written in the presence or absence of particular species, in the colour of the anemones and the population density of the periwinkles, The health of the coralline algae that painted the pool floors in shades of pale pink and dusty rose. In the evenings, when the lamp was lit and the clockwork mechanism was wound and the first careful scan of the horizon had confirmed that the night's shipping traffic was behaving as expected, the keeper sometimes walked this path to the cliff edge and stood for a few minutes in the dark, listening. The sea at night had a different voice than the sea by day. The visual information, the colour and the movement and the shape of waves was reduced or absent, and this reduction focused the auditory experience in a way that was, after all these years, still remarkable to him. The sound of water on stone, the deeper, slower sound of larger waves against the base of the headland, felt as much as heard a low percussion transmitted through the rock beneath his feet, the hiss of foam receding across the shelves between one wave and the next, the cry of a night bird somewhere over the water, a petrel or a shearwater, one of those oceanic birds that seem to belong entirely to the sea and visited land only under duress, its call a thin, carrying sound that crossed the water and the darkness and reached the keeper's ears as a kind of greeting from the middle distance, from the vast unlit space between the coast and the horizon. He stood. He listened, and then he went back inside to tend the light. The keeper's day began before it was a day. It began in the absolute darkness of 4 in the morning, sometimes 3, depending on the season and the weather and the particular demands of the night, when the alarm of his internal clock, refined by years of practice into something far more reliable than any mechanical instrument the 19th century could offer, brought him upright in his bed before full consciousness had assembled itself around him, so that for the first several seconds of wakefulness he existed in a state that was neither sleep nor waking but something in between, alert to the sounds of the house and the wind and the sea, registering these sounds with the automatic professional attention that never fully disengaged even in sleep, yet still half dreaming, still carrying some fragment of wherever he had been. The bedroom was cold. This was simply the condition of a coastal house in autumn and winter, and the shoulder months on either side, the fire in the room below, banked at night to preserve coals for morning relighting, produced insufficient heat to keep the upper chamber warm through the long dark hours, and the wind that found its way through the clapboard siding and around the window frames carried with it the temperature of the open Atlantic, which was in these months a temperature of serious intent, of genuine cold that was not interested in the preferences of the human beings living in its path. The keeper had learned to sleep under several layers, heavy quilts made by his wife in the long winter evenings, their surfaces a patchwork of fabrics from worn-out garments, every piece carrying its history of colour and pattern, and the particular weight of remembered use. He pulled these layers back now with deliberate economy of motion, not lingering, not permitting himself the luxury of postponement. His clothes were on the chair beside the bed, laid out the night before in a sequence that permitted dressing in the dark without confusion. Trousers, heavy wool shirt, thick knitted stockings, the whole assembly placed in the order of putting on rather than the order of taking off, so that the first garment his hand found was the first garment to be worn. This was the habit of a man who had understood, through the experience of cold mornings, that confusion in the dark was both inefficient and unpleasant, and that the small daily effort of thoughtful preparation eliminated both inefficiency and unpleasantness with a single action. He dressed quickly, the wool shirt rough and warm against his skin, his fingers working the buttons by touch with the fluency of 10,000 repetitions. He did not light a lamp for this first movement through the house. He had no need of one. Every dimension of the space was internalized, the number of steps from the bedside to the door, the exact placement of the chair back that he used to guide himself to the head of the stairs, the particular creak of the third step from the bottom that he had long since stopped trying to avoid and now used instead as an auditory landmark, a sound that said, "You are here, you are almost down, the kitchen is 4 steps ahead of you." In the kitchen, built the fire. The coals from the previous night were still alive beneath their layer of ash. He had learnt to read the warmth of the banked stove from across the room, a faint emanation of heat that distinguished still living coals from truly dead ash. And this reading was always confirmed when he opened the firebox door and found the orange suggestion of life in the grey-black depths. He added kindling first, thin splits of dry pine that caught almost immediately on the coals, their resins crackling and spitting briefly before settling into a clean, quick flame, and then progressively larger pieces of wood, building the fire with the patience of a person who understands that haste here produces smoke and incomplete combustion, and a fire that burns hot briefly and then subsides, where patience produces a steady, deep, sustaining heat that will carry the morning's work. While the fire built itself, he filled the kettle from the water barrel that stood in the corner of the kitchen, a large barrel of hammered wood, its staves darkened by decades of water, its iron hoops reddened with surface rust that had not been permitted to progress beyond the surface. The water in the barrel came from the cistern behind the house, which collected rainwater from the roof through a system of wooden gutters. The taste of this water was clean and slightly mineral, with the faint wooden note of the barrel it had rested in. He placed the kettle on the crane hook over the fire and stood for a moment listening to the first sounds of its warming, a faint ticking as the metal expanded. Then, after several minutes, the beginning of the low vocal sound of approaching boil, sound that was one of the most domestic and reassuring sounds in his entire sonic world. He went then to the tower. The passage through the neck, the covered walkway connecting the house to the base of the tower, was always cold, the wind finding its way through the gaps in the siding, with a persistence that no amount of caulking entirely defeated. He moved through it quickly, opening the heavy door at the far end, and entering the base of the tower with the slight adjustment in air temperature and smell that always accompanied the transition from the house to the stone, cooler, damper, with the oil and metal scent of the lighthouse structure replacing the wood smoke and food smells of the domestic space. He climbed the staircase in the dark, hand on the central column, his feet finding the grating steps with the complete confidence of repetition. The iron rang softly under his boots as he rose, that dry, metallic music climbing ahead of him through the spiral. In the watchroom, he checked the weights of the clockwork mechanism. By this hour of the morning, after a night of operation, the weights would be near their lower limit, the cable nearly fully descended. He wound them back up, the crank turning with a smooth, weighted resistance that required his full physical engagement, his body leaning into the work, the mechanism clicking and catching with the satisfaction of a well-made device doing what it was built to do. When the weights were at the top of their travel, he stopped, breathing slowly, listening to the mechanism resume its motion above him. He climbed through the trapdoor into the lantern room. The lamp was burning low, not in danger of extinction, but noticeably reduced from its earlier brightness, the oil in the reservoir having descended through the night's consumption to a level that required topping up before the dawn extinguishing. He checked the level carefully, added oil from the small can he carried up with him, adjusted the wick with the brass wick trimmer, a small, precise tool like a pair of scissors with curved blades, designed to remove the carbonized crust that formed on the wick's tip overnight and reduced the quality of the flame. The adjustment was minor. The flame brightened fractionally, outside in the darkness that was just beginning, somewhere far in the east, to contemplate becoming something lighter. The beam from the lighthouse continued its patient rotation across the surface of the sea. He stood at the glass of the lantern room and looked east. Thin line of colour, barely distinguishable from the darkness above it, the suggestion of grey, the first whispered sentence of a new morning beginning somewhere beyond the curve of the ocean, travelling toward this coast at the speed of the turning earth. He watched it come. The extinguishing of the lamp at dawn was not, the keeper's understanding of his work, the end of the night's labour. It was the beginning of the day's. He waited until the light on the eastern horizon had progressed from suggestion to certainty, from that first tentative grey line to the fuller, warmer tone of genuine early morning, when the horizon was clearly visible and the shapes of any vessels in the area could be distinguished by the natural light without the aid of the lighthouse beam. This was the professional standard. The lamp remained lit until it was no longer necessary, and it was not extinguished a moment before that standard was met. Some keepers, over the years had developed the habit of extinguishing the lamp at a fixed hour regardless of the actual light conditions, and these keepers were noted unfavourably in the inspection reports that the Lighthouse Board's district inspectors filed after their periodic visits. The lamp served the sea, not the calendar, and the sea's requirements for light were determined by conditions, not by clocks. When the morning was sufficiently established, the keeper turned off the oil supply to the lamp and watched the flame diminish through its stages, from its working brightness steady and certain, through a brief heightening as the oil pressure dropped and then equalized, and then down through amber and orange and a small concentrated blue-yellow point of light that sat at the tip of the wick for a moment, perfectly composed, before going out altogether and leaving behind it only the smell of hot brass and lamp oil, and the faint blue thread of smoke that rose from the spent wick and dissipated upward into the glass-enclosed space of the lantern. The lamp was out. The day's work could begin. The first task always was the wick. The cotton wick that fed oil to the flame was, in a sense, the most critical component of the entire lighting system, more critical than the clockwork, more critical than the lens, because without a properly trimmed and maintained wick, neither the clockwork nor the lens could produce an acceptable light. A wick that had burned for an entire night bore evidence of that burning in the carbonized crust that had formed on its upper surface, a brittle, blackened layer that, if left in place for the following night's lighting, would cause the flame to burn unevenly, producing a flickering, smoky light rather than the steady, clear flame that the Fresnel lens required to do its work properly. Wick trimming was performed with the precision of a skilled craft. The keeper used his trimming scissors, those specialized curved blade instruments, to remove the carbonized material cleanly, cutting just below the black layer to expose fresh white cotton fiber. The cut had to be level, perfectly horizontal across the full width of the wick, because any irregularity in the wick's upper surface would produce a corresponding irregularity in the flame's profile. Too much removed, and the flame the following night would be undersized, burning below the optimal focal point of the lens. Too little, and the carbon residue would degrade the light. The keeper's hand, over years of this work, had developed a precision that was partly skill and partly something more like instinct, a judgment too fast and too consistent to be entirely conscious, the accumulated result of thousands of repetitions translated into muscle memory. After the wick, the lens. The Fresnel lens was cleaned every morning without exception. Night of burning had deposited a thin film of combustion products on the surfaces of the prisms, a barely visible coating that nevertheless had a measurable effect on the lens's refractive properties and, consequently, on the quality of the light it would produce the following night. The cleaning protocol was fixed and invariable. First, a careful inspection of each prism surface in the morning light, tilting the lens slowly to catch the light at different angles and reveal any streaks or deposits. Then cleaning with the soft cloth and the preparation of diluted vinegar, working methodically from the top ring of prisms down through the middle sections to the bull's eye at the centre, then buffing with the dry chamois to remove all traces of moisture, then a final inspection in the raking light. The smell of vinegar in the lantern room on these mornings was sharp and clean and temporary. It dissipated quickly in the ventilated space, and the keeper had come to associate it with the particular satisfaction of the morning's work, the transition from the soft amber, toil-scented world of the nighttime lamp to the crisp, light-filled, vinegar-scented world of the morning cleaning. These were two entirely different sensory environments produced by the same small room, and moving between them each morning had a quality of ritual passage, of crossing from one mode of being into another. The brass was next. The brass of the lamp mechanism, the lens pedestal, the ventilator cap at the top of the lantern, the handrails around the exterior gallery. All of it required the keeper's daily attention with the soft cloth and the rotten stone and oil preparation. Brass in a maritime environment does not rest. The salt air attacks it perpetually, and the tarnish that accumulates overnight on surfaces that were polished the day before is a measure not of the keeper's negligence, but of the intensity of the environment's hostility to anything that attempts to maintain a bright surface. the keeper polished with the equanimity of a person who has entirely abandoned any expectation of a permanent victory. The tarnish would return. It always returned. The polishing was not an attempt to defeat it, but an ongoing negotiation, a daily reassertion of the standard against which entropy perpetually pushed. When he polished brass, the keeper worked in silence, and in the particular quality of attention that physical, repetitive work produces when it is done by someone who has done it so many times that it requires no conscious oversight. His hands moved across the curved surfaces of the metal, while his mind occupied itself with other things: the weather, the shipping traffic he had observed during the night, the item in the logbook that required follow-up, the state of the oil stores in the supply room at the base of the tower. These practical thoughts moved through his mind with the same slow, patient quality as his hands moved across the brass, unhurried, thorough, organized in the particular way of a person who has learned through experience that the mind, like the lamp, produces its best light when the wick is properly trimmed and the fuel is adequate and there is no unnecessary flickering. The oil stores required daily inspection as well. The supply room at the base of the tower held the barrels and cans of lamp oil, whale oil in the early decades, replaced gradually by lard oil and then by kerosene as the century progressed and the economics of the whaling industry shifted and the chemistry of illuminants improved. The keeper measured the remaining supply against a gauge mounted on the wall, a simple dipstick and scale system that translated the weight of remaining oil into days of operation remaining, and recorded the figure in the logbook with the same careful penmanship he applied to all his record-keeping. If the supply was approaching the threshold at which a resupply order needed to be placed, he noted this separately on a sheet reserved for such communications to be handed to the next supply tender or lighthouse inspector who appeared. This was the nature of the work, not dramatic, not intermittently heroic, but daily, thorough, repetitive, and completely consequential. Every wick trimmed carefully was a ship guided safely. Every lens cleaned properly was a captain who arrived in port rather than on the rocks. The keeper held this understanding in him not as an abstract principle but as a lived reality. The way a person holds their breath when they are underwater, not as a concept to be considered but as a condition of being immediate and physical and requiring no justification. The work was done when it was done properly, not before. On the small desk in the watchroom, positioned to receive the best of the northern light coming through the slit window in the stairwell above, sat the logbook. It was a bound volume of moderate size, perhaps 12 inches by 8, its cover of dark cloth boards slightly bowed by the cumulative humidity of the coastal years, its spine reinforced by strips of linen glued carefully in place at the moment of rebinding, which the keeper had performed himself using a technique learned from a pamphlet distributed by the Lighthouse Board, along with the other operational manuals that governed the station's administration. The logbook was, after the lamp itself, the most important object in the lighthouse. This was not merely a sentimental designation, but a practical and administrative reality. The Lighthouse Board's inspectors, when they visited quarterly, when the system was functioning as intended, sometimes less frequently in the practical reality of large district territories and limited inspector staffing, reviewed the logbook with an attention that matched the keeper's own. The logbook was the testimony of the station's operation, the evidence by which the keeper's competence and conscientiousness were evaluated, and the record from which any investigation of an incident, a shipwreck, a missing vessel, a complaint from a ship's captain would begin. The handwriting in the logbook was the keeper's own, which meant that the logbook read as a whole across the years of a posting was also a kind of unconscious autobiography. The handwriting changed over time in ways that told their own story. In the first years at this station, the entries were written with a careful, slightly laboured neatness, the handwriting of a man attending to his letters, aware of being assessed, forming each character with deliberate control. As the years passed and the routine deepened, the handwriting relaxed into something more confident and more personal. A looser, faster hand that sacrificed some of the formal neatness for a naturalness and an ease that was, in its way, more beautiful. In the years when illness had visited the family, or when the winter had been particularly hard, the handwriting contracted and slowed again, becoming smaller and more careful, though the act of writing was something the keeper was doing with additional deliberateness to compensate for other things that had become less controllable. Each day's entry followed a fixed format established by the Lighthouse Board's operational manual and reproduced in print at the top of each logbook page as a template. Date, time, weather conditions, sky, wind, direction and force on the Beaufort scale, precipitation, sea state visibility in miles estimated by the keeper's trained eye, lamp status, lit, extinguished time of each operation, any vessels observed in distress, any maintenance performed, any supply levels checked and recorded, any visitors to the station, any unusual occurrences. Within this fixed structure, however, the keeper's personality expressed itself in the particulars. The weather observations, for instance. The Beaufort scale provided a standardized vocabulary for wind force, light air, light breeze, gentle breeze, moderate breeze, fresh breeze, strong breeze, and so on, through near gale, gale, strong gale, storm, violent storm, and hurricane. The keeper used this vocabulary faithfully for the official record, but in the margins of the logbook and in the entries for days when something in the weather deserved more than a Beaufort number, he wrote additional observations in a language more personal and more specific. The quality of the light at sunset on a clear evening in October, described in a sentence that found room for the exact amber of it, and the way the water held the colour for several minutes after the sky had moved on. The sound of the northeast wind in the rigging of a fishing boat anchored in the cove, described as resembling the low note of a church organ, sustained and trembling, the temperature of a February morning captured not in degrees Fahrenheit, but in the physical experience of it, the way the cold entered the lungs with a sharpness that was not unpleasant, almost like the taste of good water, clean and deep and of considerable character. These marginal observations were technically unauthorized. The logbook's format did not include a section for literary impression, but no inspector ever objected to them, and in some of the inspector's visit reports that survive in the historical record, there are brief approving references to the quality of the station's records, comments that suggest the inspectors were not insensible to the value of a keeper who brought genuine attention to the act of observation. The entries for significant weather events were the longest. When a nor'easter moved up the coast, those great persistent storms that arrived from the northeast and settled in for 2 or 3 days of heavy rain and gale-force wind and seas, that the keeper could see from the lantern room as enormous dark shapes rising and falling offshore, their crests blowing off in long white lines of spume, the entries expanded to fill the available space on the page, and sometimes overflowed onto the margins and the blank verso pages that the board's format left for additional notes. These storm entries were among the most remarkable documents in the logbook, both as meteorological records and as prose. The keeper wrote about weather the way a person writes about something they have spent years learning to understand and have not yet exhausted, with attention, with respect, with the specific vocabulary of long acquaintance. He noted the vessels he observed during these storms, their running lights appearing and disappearing in the rain and spray as the seas lifted them and dropped them, their positions relative to the known hazards of the coast, his assessment of whether their navigation appeared sound or whether they were being set toward the ledges by the current. When a vessel appeared to be in danger, he noted this immediately, and described what signals he had made, the firing of the station's fog gun, the display of the distress flags from the flagstaff beside the house, the burning of a torch on the cliff edge in the ancient signal of emergency. Most of the time the vessels recovered their position and passed safely. Occasionally they did not, and these entries are written in a hand that is slightly less steady than usual, the words chosen with the painful care of a person who has witnessed something terrible and is attempting to record it accurately while the witnessing is still recent and raw. The logbook was submitted to the district office at the end of each quarter, replaced by a new volume. The old volumes were filed in the district archives, in some cases preserved, in others lost to the predictable vulnerabilities of official records: fire, flood, disorganization, the gradual entropy that overtakes paper when it is not valued sufficiently to be protected. But some survive. In the archives of the Maine State Museum, in the collections of the New England Historic Genealogical Society, in the careful custody of local historical societies in the small coastal towns where these men served. The logbooks of the 19th-century lighthouse keepers exist still. Their cloth boards bowed and their pages foxed with age, their handwriting faded from black to brown, they wait on their shelves with the patience of everything that has outlasted the hands that made it. You could hold one today, you could open it to any page and find the weather of a February morning in 1852, recorded in careful brown ink. You could read about the northeast gale of October 1867, the fog that persisted for 11 days in July of 1859, the morning in March when a schooner appeared out of the darkness bearing damage to her foremast, and her captain came ashore looking 20 years older than his age, and sat in the keeper's kitchen and drank tea without speaking for a very long time. You could read all of this, and the hands that wrote it would not be so very far away. The kitchen table was the centre of the household's daily life in a way that has no precise modern equivalent, a fact that requires some pause to appreciate, because the kitchen table of a 19th-century lighthouse keeper's household was not merely a surface for eating, but the primary zone of domestic existence for every activity that required a flat, horizontal, well-lit and warm place in which to occur. It was where the keeper sat to write the logbook entries he had composed mentally during the nighttime watch, the inkwell placed carefully on a folded cloth to prevent the vibration of the table's surface from disturbing the flow of the pen. It was where his wife mended clothing in the evenings, the lamplight falling across her work and her hands moving through the fabric with a practised economy of motion that was in its way as skilled and as consequential as the keeper's tending of the lamp. It was where the children did their lessons when the weather prevented the walk to the schoolhouse in the village, which during the winter months was a frequent condition, their slates and chalk and worn primer books spread across the table's surface alongside whatever else was occupying the other members of the household, the whole domestic enterprise proceeding in a state of productive cohabitation that required a certain practised tolerance of proximity. The table itself was made of a single wide plank of pine, perhaps 3 inches thick and 20 inches wide, the kind of timber that came from very old trees and is not available in the same way now. Its surface worn to a pale smooth polish by decades of cleaning, the grain of the wood still visible beneath the surface sheen, the knots standing slightly proud where the softer surrounding wood had worn away faster. The table's legs were turned from a darker wood, possibly cherry, their surfaces darkened by age, and the hands that had rested on them. It had been in the house before the current keeper arrived, and it would remain after he was gone, continuing its patient service through whatever household came next. Meals in the lighthouse keeper's household were a function of the season, the weather, the state of the provisions, and the keeper's wife's considerable improvisational skill in working within all 3 constraints simultaneously. In summer and early autumn, the table was spread with the relative abundance of the season. Fresh vegetables from the kitchen garden, salt fish supplemented by whatever the keeper caught himself from the rocks at the base of the headland, where the conditions were reliable for mackerel in July and pollock in August. A chowder made on a Thursday from the morning's catch, its base a rich creamy broth of salt pork and onions and potatoes, thickened by the starch of the potatoes dissolving into it over the hour of slow simmering. The fish added last and cooked gently so that it held its texture in large soft flakes rather than crumbling into the broth. The chowder was served in deep bowls with bread baked that morning in the Dutch oven, a dense, slightly sour bread made with the sourdough starter that the keeper's wife maintained in a stoneware crock on the shelf above the fireplace, feeding it flour and water every few days as one feeds any living thing that is providing a service. The bread had a thick, dark crust that shattered slightly when pressed, and its interior crumb was moist and irregular, full of the air bubbles that the starter's fermentation had built into it over the long, slow rise. In winter, the meals contracted toward the simpler and the storable. Salt pork and beans cooked in the bean pot that sat at the back of the hearth from Friday evening through Sunday morning. The low, persistent heat of the banked fire transforming the dried beans from their hard, dry opacity into something soft and deeply savoury. The salt pork rendering slowly into the pot and enriching everything around it with its fat. The smell of beans cooking was, in the lighthouse keeper's household, specifically the smell of the weekend, a slow, patient smell that built through Saturday, deepening and intensifying as the pot reduced, so that by Sunday morning, when the pot was brought to the table, the smell alone had been present in the house for 36 hours and had become part of the atmosphere of those particular days, as identifying as the particular quality of the light. Cornbread, baked apples, salt fish cakes, made from dried salt cod soaked overnight in fresh water, and then combined with boiled potato and fried in the cast-iron pan in a pool of salt pork fat, until the exterior was a deep golden brown, crisp and yielding simultaneously. These were not the foods of abundance, they were the foods of sufficiency and skill, the foods of people who worked with what was available, and available was not always varied, but was, in practised hands, always good. Tea was the constant. The keeper drank it at every meal and between meals, and in the night watches and on the cold mornings when the fire was just built and the kitchen had not yet warmed, and in the summer afternoons when the warmth of it was the last thing one might think one needed, but which provided, tea invariably does, a specific and irreplaceable comfort regardless of the temperature of the air around it. The tea was black, steeped strong enough to be nearly opaque in the cup, drunk with sugar and sometimes with the addition of a small amount of evaporated milk from a tin, a practical substitute for fresh milk on those days when the cow's production was low or the trip to the village had not been made. The cups were thick-walled stoneware, heavy and dense, and they retained the heat of the tea for a satisfying length of time, so that a cup set down at the edge of the table while the keeper attended to some other small task was still warm when he returned to it, still sending its thin, fragrant steam upward into the kitchen air. When neighbours came, which was not often, the headland being somewhat remote, and the keeper's schedule not reliably amenable to extended social visits, the kitchen table expanded its role to accommodate hospitality, neighbour from the nearest farm arriving with a basket of eggs and some interesting conversation, and the exchange of information about the wider world that the keeper's logbook provided in ways no newspaper quite matched. The assistant keeper from a neighbouring station, stopping to share a meal and compare the notes of professional colleagues who had spent similar nights watching similar skies, the occasional representative of the Lighthouse board on an informal visit, accepting a cup of tea and reviewing the station's equipment with the practised eye of someone who has seen a great many lighthouse kitchens and is making ongoing private assessments of the relationship between domestic order and professional competence. At these gatherings, the table held its additional weight with the equanimity of old, dense pine, and the kitchen produced its warmth and its smells and its hospitality with the ease of a place that has been doing this work for long enough to have it fully internalized. The fire crackled, the tea steamed, the bread sat on its board at the center of the table half-eaten, its cut surface slowly hardening in the warm air of the kitchen, its crumbs still faintly fragrant with the sourdough tang that was the particular signature of this household's particular starter, different from any other starter on this coast, the way handwriting is different from any other person's handwriting. Outside, the sea moved in its long, slow, and entirely unsentimental rhythm. Inside, people ate together in the warmth. The fog came to the New England coast the way it always comes to cold coasts, not with announcement or dramatic arrival, but with a gradual thickening of the air, a softening of the horizon's edge, blurring of the distant islands that began as mere haziness and progressed through stages of increasing obscuration until the world beyond 100 yards had simply ceased to exist in any visible sense, replaced by a grey-white uniformity that was not quite cloud and not quite water, but something in between. Something that the air itself had become when the warm currents from the south met the cold Gulf of Maine water at the surface, and the temperature gradient between them exceeded the dew point, and the moisture that had been invisible in the air suddenly quietly made itself known. The keeper had a particular relationship with fog. It was not fear exactly, though fog had the capacity to kill through the simple mechanism of navigation rendered impossible, and the coast remaining exactly where it had always been, patient and hard, and entirely unwilling to move out of the way. A ship's captain in thick fog, without the lighthouse's visual guidance, was dependent on other things: the foghorn, the bell, the gun, the soundings taken with the lead line, the calculations of dead reckoning that accumulated error with every mile sailed in uncertain conditions. Keeper who understood this, who had internalized the specific lethality of coastal fog, who had perhaps seen the evidence of it in the wreckage that washed up on the rocks below after a bad night, approached fog not with fear, but with a heightened, almost reverent attentiveness. Fog meant the work became more demanding. It meant the stakes of every failure to respond promptly and properly were more immediately consequential. The fog bell was mounted on a wooden structure beside the tower, a large bell of cast bronze, perhaps 2 feet in diameter, its surface weathered to the deep, warm grey of old bronze that has been exposed to salt air for many years. Its tone when struck a low, tresonant sound that travelled remarkably well through fog, the dense, humid air actually conducting lower frequencies more efficiently than clear air, so that the fog bell's voice carried farther through the obscured world than it did on clear days. The bell was struck by a mechanical hammer operated initially by a hand-wound clockwork mechanism, which required the keeper to return to the bell house every 30 minutes to rewind the weights, and later in the century by more sophisticated mechanisms that extended the interval between windings. But in the early decades of the posting, fog meant the keeper striking the bell by hand. There was a particular quality to this work that those who have never done it can perhaps only approximate through imagination. Standing in the fog at the bell station, pulling the rope that swung the hammer against the bell's flank with a precise, measured force. Not so hard that the bell would crack, not so soft that the tone would fail to carry every 30 seconds through hours of dense obscuration, while the sea sounds moved around him in their disorienting, directionless way, and the moisture settled on his collar and the backs of his hands and the brim of his hat. The regularity of the striking was essential. Ship's navigators who knew this coast knew the interval of the bell and used it as a timing reference, counting the seconds between strikes to estimate their distance from the station. Irregular bell, one struck too frequently in the keeper's fatigue or anxiety, or with intervals that varied in length, was a bell whose voice could not be trusted, and a bell whose voice could not be trusted was very nearly worse than no bell at all. He struck the bell with the patience of a man who has chosen patience as a professional methodology. In the later part of the century, the fog signal was supplemented or replaced by the fog horn, a steam-powered device that produced a deep, penetrating blast of sound at regular intervals, its voice so loud and so low frequency that it could be felt as much as heard from close range, physical vibration that the keeper felt in his chest when he stood near it during operation. The fog horn required its own maintenance regime. The steam boiler that powered it needed to be lit and brought to pressure before the fog signal could begin, which meant that the keeper's response to encroaching fog included not only the immediate action of activating the signal, but the preliminary work of building the fire under the boiler and waiting with the particular tension of a person watching the pressure gauge while the fog thickened outside for the steam to reach operating pressure. He learned over years to anticipate fog not through any supernatural faculty, but through the trained attention of a person who has spent enough time watching a particular environment to recognize the subtle precursors of its behavioral changes. The quality of the light on the water in the late afternoon. The temperature differential between the surface air and his hand held a foot above the ground. The behavior of the fog in the morning, whether it burned off cleanly with the sun's warmth, or whether it retreated only partially and then returned, which it sometimes did, rolling back in from offshore in the early afternoon with a deliberateness that suggested it had merely been waiting. The smell of the air, though this is difficult to articulate precisely, experienced fog watchers speak of a particular quality to the air in the hours before a dense fog, a softness, a heaviness, slightly increased proximity of the smell of the sea as though the sea had moved closer without moving at all. When the keeper judged that fog was coming, and his judgment was right often enough to be trusted, though never so right as to be invulnerable to surprise, he prepared. Oil checked and topped up, wick trimmed, clockwork wound, the boiler fire laid and ready to light on short notice. The logbook opened to the current day's entry, a pencil sharpened beside it. The keeper himself dressed appropriately, the oilskin coat from the hook by the door, the heavy woolen cap that pulled down over the ears, the sea boots from the corner of the entryway. ready. The fog would come when it came. This was not a matter over which readiness had any effect. What readiness affected was the quality of the response, the speed with which the signal was activated, the vigilance with which the night's watch was conducted, the accuracy of the logbook entries that recorded the duration and density of the obscuration, the care with which the keeper scanned the water for the running lights of vessels feeling their way along the coast in the blind, slow, searching manner of ships in fog. He would stand at the lantern-room glass and peer into the grey wall that the fog had constructed in every direction, and somewhere in that grey wall would be ships, and aboard those ships were people who had left somewhere and intended to arrive somewhere else. Tanned between their intention and its fulfilment stood the coast of Maine, and between the coast of Maine and the ships stood the lighthouse, and in the lighthouse stood the keeper, listening, watching, waiting, ready to be the fixed point in an uncertain world. There came a point in late November, a particular morning that arrived without announcement but was recognizable immediately as a threshold, crossing from one season into another, when the character of the coast changed fundamentally, and the lighthouse keeper's world contracted around him like a house whose windows have all been shuttered simultaneously. The change was not only in the weather. Though the weather changed dramatically and memorably, it was in the quality of the light, which in the weeks following the November turn went thin and grey and low to the horizon, arriving late each morning and departing early each afternoon, in a way that made the days feel like mere parentheses between the long dark hours of the night watch. It was in the sound of the sea, which in winter lost the variety and conversation of the warmer months, and became something simpler and more insistent. A heavier, slower rhythm of large grey swells moving in from the North Atlantic, with the weight of great distances behind them, rising against the headland in long, smooth walls before breaking across the ledges in explosions of white water that, on the worst days, sent spray all the way to the base of the tower. It was in the smell of the air, which lost the complexity of summer, that layered mixture of salt and seaweed, and the warmth rising from the sun-heated rock, and became simply cold, clean and cold, and carrying in it the mineral scent of ice and distance, of the regions far to the north from which the wind had come. The keeper had experienced this transition many times. It had not become less significant with repetition. If anything, each passing year made him more attentive to the specific texture of the season's change, more aware of the particular qualities of this coastline's version of winter, its specific tone and character, different from inland winter in ways that went beyond the obvious fact of the sea's proximity. Coastal winter here was a dark, wet, windy thing, full of sudden shifts between hard frost and mild grey drizzle, between flat calms and full gales, with none of the settled consistency of the deep inland cold that a person could come to terms with and predict. By December, the harbour had begun to ice at its margins, thin, transparent sheets of new ice forming overnight at the waterline in the protected coves, thickening gradually through the cold weeks, opaque and then white, and then the particular blue-white of old ice that has been compressed by its own weight into something denser and more crystalline than its origin. The fishing boats, those that had not been hauled out and stored for the winter, moved carefully through this ice in the early mornings, their wooden hulls nudging the floating sheets aside with sounds that the keeper could hear from the lantern-room, a faint, glassy percussion that carried far in the cold air. The outer harbour rarely froze completely. The tidal movement and the action of the waves prevented it, but in exceptional winters, in the years when the cold came early and stayed persistently, and the winds blew from the north for weeks without significant moderation, ice could form well offshore. The individual pans and flows from inland rivers and the iced margins of smaller harbours accumulating in the Gulf of Maine into fields of drift ice that the wind pushed down the coast in slow grinding processions. These drift ice events were beautiful and extremely dangerous. A vessel caught in heavy drift ice could be beset, held fast, unable to manoeuvre, and then damaged or crushed as the floes pressed against her hull with the slow, undefeatable force of thousands of tons of ice driven by the wind. The keeper noted the presence of drift ice in his logbook with the same careful attention he gave to fog and storm. He described its extent as best he could estimate from the lantern room with his telescope, the long brass-barreled instrument that lived on a shelf in the watchroom, and extended his vision across the water to the limits of the natural light. He noted the direction of its movement, the approximate size of the floes, the presence of any vessels he could see among or near the ice. These observations had practical value for ships' captains who made port at the harbours along this stretch of coast, and who consulted the keeper's log as a source of navigational intelligence, supplementing whatever they could determine from direct observation. Inside the lighthouse house, winter was a season of careful domestic management. The firewood, stacked with such care through the summer and autumn, now revealed the wisdom of that care as it was drawn down through the cold months at a rate that the keeper tracked mentally with the ongoing arithmetic of warmth against cold how much remained, how many weeks of winter remained in reasonable estimate, whether the ratio between the two was comfortable or concerning. In bad winters the calculation tended toward concerning, and the keeper supplemented the wood supply with trips to the wooded lot on the mainland side of the neck, cutting additional timber and hauling it back on the sled that served this purpose. The work of cold days and insufficient daylight accomplished with the focused economy of a person who understands that physical effort in the cold is a loan taken against the body's warmth reserves and must be repaid by a return to shelter before the interest becomes unmanageable. The children, when there were children in the house, adapted to winter with the elastic resourcefulness of young people who have never known a season that could not be made interesting. The snowdrifts that accumulated against the north side of the house were tunnelled into the ice of the inner cove when it was thick enough to bear weight, and the keeper tested it carefully, driving the heel of his boot into its surface along the margin. Testimating its thickness by the sound and resistance of the blow was skated upon with the long-bladed skates that fastened to the soles of ordinary boots with a screw-clamp and a leather strap, the children's figures describing wide arcs across the grey-white surface of the frozen cove, their breath plumbing in the cold air, their laughter carrying up to the lantern room where the keeper, pausing in his morning work, could hear it through the glass. The long winter evenings were the social heart of the household. After supper, when the dishes were cleared and the fire was built up for the evening, the family gathered around the kitchen table under the lamplight and occupied themselves with the variety of hand activities that the 19th century produced in its people as naturally as the century produced its weather: knitting, mending, the braiding of new sections of the parlour rug from strips of worn fabric, the construction and repair of small equipment whose design required only patience, and the basic tools that any household maintained. The keeper sometimes read aloud from the almanac, from a novel obtained from the village, from the navigational publications that formed part of his professional library, and which, reared aloud in the warm kitchen on a January evening with the wind in the chimney and the sea audible beyond the walls, had a strange, almost poetic quality, their precise technical language sitting oddly and beautifully against the domestic context of their recitation. Silence was not uncomfortable here. It was simply a different quality of company. The winter was long and the nights were longer, and the keeper tended the light through all of it, climbing his iron staircase in the deep cold of 2 in the morning, the metal of the handrail cold as stone through his gloves, the lamp burning its faithful circle at the top of its tower, the sea dark and moving and enormous beyond the glass. The lighthouse keeper was not, despite the romantic image that has accumulated around the figure over the century and a half since his time, solitary hermit, living in cheerful isolation at the edge of the world. He was more often than not a family man. He had a wife. He had children, usually several, because the 19th century produced children in quantities that reflected both the absence of effective contraception and the practical reality of a domestic economy in which additional children represented, beyond a certain threshold of the eldest's development into usefulness, an increase in the household's capacity to manage the considerable work of lighthouse keeping. The federal government, in its lighthouse regulations, formally acknowledged the domestic arrangement by including in the keeper's compensation a dwelling for the family and, in some periods and some positions, separate allowance for a wife who took on a defined portion of the station's maintenance work, an arrangement that reflected the government's practical recognition that without the domestic partner's labour, the position as defined could not be adequately filled by a single person. The keeper's wife was, in the lived reality of Lighthouse life, a co-keeper in everything but title and much of the time in title as well. She kept the supply inventories. She maintained the correspondence with the district office that the operational requirements of the station generated. She tended the lamp during her husband's illness or absence, climbing the iron staircase in the darkness with the can of oil and the trimming scissors and the soft polishing cloth, performing the same tasks with the same precision that the logbook recorded and the inspectors evaluated. Women's contributions to the lighthouse service of the 19th century are documented in the records with an inconsistency that reflects the period's inconsistency in how it documented women's professional work generally, sometimes acknowledged, sometimes subsumed under the keeper's record, sometimes visible only in the change in handwriting in the logbook entries during periods when we know from other sources that the keeper was incapacitated. The children grew up inside the routine of the lighthouse in a way that shaped their understanding of work and time and responsibility in patterns that remained with them for the rest of their lives. The older children had specific duties, carrying oil, winding the clockwork weights under supervision, helping with the brass polishing in the mornings, keeping a watch on the weather vane, and reporting significant changes to the keeper during the times when he was occupied with other tasks. These were not token contributions, but real participation in the station's operation, graduated by age and capability in the way of all apprenticeship systems, the child moving from observation to assistance to independent competence over the years of growing up inside the work. The walk to the village schoolhouse, perhaps a mile and a half along the Neck Road and then another half-mile along the main coastal road, was the children's primary daily excursion into the world beyond the headland. They walked this road in all weathers that did not rise to the level of the genuinely dangerous, their school things in a canvas bag over one shoulder, their boots appropriate to the season, rubber-soled in wet weather, wool-lined in cold. The road was unpaved, of course, and in spring it was a study in the various depths and textures of coastal New England mud, a substance of remarkable persistence and variety that clung to boot soles with a possessiveness that seemed almost personal, and which the children tracked into the schoolhouse, and the teacher addressed with the patient resignation of a person who has long since made her peace with the agricultural realities of her students' lives. In the village, the keeper's family occupied a specific social position, respected, somewhat set apart, the object of a mild civic pride that the community took in its lighthouse. The keeper was an employee of the federal government, which gave him a certain formal status that most of the village's residents, being fishermen or farmers or tradespeople, did not share. He received a government salary, modest but reliable, which in the boom and bust economy of a coastal fishing community made him an object of quiet envy in the bad years and of quiet respect in all years. His access to shipping traffic information from the logbook, from conversations with captains and pilots, from the perspective of the lantern room that gave him a view of the coast's maritime activity that no one else had, made him a valued source of the practical intelligence that a fishing community needed to make its economic decisions. He went to church on Sundays when the station's operations permitted, which was more Sundays than the strict mathematics of the watch schedule might suggest, because the keeper was skilled at working with the tidal rhythms and the weather patterns to identify the Sundays when the demand on his personal presence at the lighthouse was minimal, calm days in settled weather, when the automated clockwork could manage the lamp for the hours of the morning service, and the keeper's attention could be directed elsewhere without serious risk. He sat in the family's pew with the particular alert stillness of a man who is listening to the sermon with one ear and the weather with the other, the habits of professional attention so deeply established that they operated continuously regardless of the social context. The friendships that the keeper formed over the years of his posting were the friendships of proximity and shared experience, the neighbouring farm family whose property abutted the Neck Road and whose children were the same ages as the keeper's own, the postmaster in the village who sorted the keeper's government mail and who shared the keeper's interest in the newspaper that arrived from Portland twice weekly, with a delay that made its news already half historical by the time it was read, but which was nonetheless eagerly consumed, the assistant keeper at the next lighthouse station down the coast, with whom the keeper maintained a correspondence that ran to many letters over the years, each letter full of the practical details and professional observations of two men who worked the same coast under the same conditions and had developed, through this shared vocation, a mutual understanding that went considerably deeper than friendship. Loneliness was not absent from this life. The keeper would not have used that word. The 19th century was not a period of articulate discussion of loneliness, which was regarded more as a condition of character weakness than as a natural human response to geographic isolation, but the evidence of it is present in the record. In the logbook entries that expand unexpectedly on winter evenings into long, careful descriptions of the stars visible between cloud breaks, as though the act of precise observation were filling a space that needed filling. In the correspondence with his family on the mainland, the letters growing more detailed and more affectionate in the darkest weeks of winter. In the way his wife's presence in the lantern room on the nights when she came up to help, her voice, her breathing, her smell, is reflected in the logbook as a kind of brightening, a warmth in the record that has nothing to do with the weather. He was not alone. But the sea was very large, then the headland was very remote, and the nights were very long. He kept the light because it needed keeping. And that was enough. And it was not always enough. And it was enough. There is a particular relationship with time that develops in a person who does the same thing every night for decades. Not boredom exactly, not the dull repetition of industrial labour which the 19th century was producing in such vast quantities in its mills and its factories, and which had its own relationship with time, a grinding, pressurized relationship in which the clock was a tyrant and each minute was a commodity owned by someone else. The lighthouse keeper's relationship with time was different in ways that reward careful consideration, because it was not a relationship of opposition but of integration. The keeper did not work against time. He worked with it in a rhythm so deeply established and so thoroughly aligned with the larger rhythms of the natural world that the distinction between the keeper's routine and the motion of the earth itself became, over years, difficult to locate precisely. He lit the lamp at dusk. He extinguished it at dawn. He wound the clockwork every 4 hours through the night. He cleaned the lens and polished the brass every morning. He checked the oil levels, he trimmed the wick, he recorded the weather, he wound the fog signal, he painted the tower in the spring, he submitted the logbook quarterly, he requisitioned supplies, he received the inspector's visit, he submitted the annual report. These things happened in their sequence, and the sequence happened within the larger sequences of the seasons, and the seasons happened within the still larger sequence of the years, and the years accumulated into decades, and the decades were the keeper's life. To experience time in this way, as a series of nested rhythms, each rhythm contained within a larger one and containing smaller ones within itself, is to experience time very differently than the modern consciousness generally does. It is to experience it not as a linear progression from birth toward death, with its attendant anxiety about the distance remaining and the distance already travelled, but as something circular, something that returns. The same tasks performed at the same hours on the same mornings of the same seasons, not the sameness of repetition, which implies a degradation of novelty, but the sameness of pattern, which implies a structure in which one can be located, a fixed coordinate system within which one's position is always knowable. The keeper knew what time it was without checking a clock, because he had internalized the tempo of his own routine so completely that the routine itself functioned as a clock, one calibrated not to the arbitrary division of the day into hours and minutes, but to the practical requirements of the station's operation. He knew it was time to wind the clockwork not because the pocket watch in his waistcoat said so, but because the lamp above him had subtly changed in quality, an almost imperceptible slowing of the lens's rotation, a fractional dimming of the beam, perceptible only to someone who had watched thousands of hours of its motion and knew its normal speed as intimately as a parent knows a child's normal breathing. This embodied knowledge of time, time known through the body's activity rather than through the instrument's reading, was a form of intelligence that the 19th century still widely possessed, and the 21st century has largely surrendered. The farmer who knew the time by the angle of the light on the barn wall, the fisherman who knew the tide by the smell of the air in the pre-dawn hours, the housewife who knew when the bread was ready by the sound of the crust and the smell of the kitchen rather than by any timer. The lighthouse keeper who knew it was 3 in the morning because his body and his lamp and his clockwork mechanism had been speaking to each other for so long that they had become, in some functional sense, a single instrument for the measurement of the night. There was, traditionally, relationship with what might be called deep time that the lighthouse keeper's position on the coast made almost unavoidable. The granite of the headland was very old, so old that any human attempt to translate its age into comprehensible terms tends to produce a kind of benign cognitive failure. The numbers are too large, the timescales too vast, the gap between geological time and human time too enormous to be bridged by any act of imagination, however sincere. The rock simply was and had been and would continue to be, and the lighthouse standing on it was a very recent development in its long biography, as recent proportionally as the last heartbeat in a long life, as recent as the last word in a very long book. The keeper was aware of this, in the way that a person who has lived alongside something very ancient for a very long time becomes aware of it, not as a philosophical proposition to be considered and debated, but as a felt reality. Background fact of existence that shapes the texture of experience without always rising to the level of explicit thought. The rock under his feet was old. The sea moving around his headland was old. The stars above the lantern room when the sky was clear were sending him light that had travelled distances so large as to be functionally identical to infinity, light that had left its sources before the granite of the headland had formed from the cooling magma of an earlier version of this coast. And here he was. Small, warm, conscious thing at the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, burning a lamp so that other small, warm, conscious things could find their way. He did not think about this in precisely these terms. He was a practical man, educated but not philosophically trained, his mental language more concrete than abstract, but the feeling of it was in him. It expressed itself in the quality of his attention, the way he watched the sea not just for navigational information, but with something more closely resembling reverence, a regard for the sea's vastness that was not fear but acknowledgement. It expressed itself in the marginalia of his logbook, those passages where the practical record expands briefly into something more personal, a description of the stars, a notation about the beauty of a particular evening, a brief, unexpanded observation about the way the light from the lantern room looks, seen from the garden in the early morning as the lamp burns low, like a small surviving star at the top of its white tower. A small, surviving star. That phrase, found in an actual keeper's logbook from the 1860s in the collection of a Maine historical society, is the kind of phrase that reaches across 150 years and takes hold of something in the reader's chest. It is not poetry exactly. The keeper was not writing poetry and knew it, and would probably have been embarrassed by the description, but it is true in the way that only the most accurate observations are true, completely and without any particular interest in impressing anyone. He saw the light as a star and called it that in his logbook on a quiet February morning, and then closed the book and went to make his breakfast. And the light turned, and the sea moved, and the morning came. The word service has accumulated, over the centuries, somewhat ambivalent resonance. In some of its uses it retains its oldest dignity, the voluntary dedication of one's capacity and attention to a purpose larger than oneself, the conscious subordination of personal preference to the requirements of something that matters, a community, a vocation, a principle. In other uses, particularly those that emerged in the hierarchical arrangements of the 19th century's domestic economy, it carries a weight of social stratification, of labour performed under conditions not freely chosen, of the complicated power arrangements that organised the lives of those who served and those who were served. The lighthouse keeper's service occupied its own peculiar position along this spectrum. He was a government employee appointed by a process that changed over the century from direct patronage appointment, in which political connections mattered considerably, to a merit-based examination system that the reformed Lighthouse Board introduced in the 1850s as part of its broader effort to professionalize the service. He was paid a salary, modest but a salary, which distinguished him from the unpaid or barely paid labour at the lower end of the 19th century's economic arrangements. He had a defined post, defined duties, defined standards by which his performance was evaluated, a defined chain of command that ran from his station through the district superintendent to the Lighthouse board in Washington. He was, in the language of his time and context, a civil servant. But the quality of the best keeper's service, and there were many of the best, many men and women who brought to this work a degree of dedication that far exceeded what the salary or the regulations required, was not primarily that of the bureaucratic servant fulfilling the minimum requirements of a defined role. It was something older and less categorizable. It was the quality of the craftsman who cannot bring himself to do careless work because carelessness is a violation of something internal, something prior to the regulations and the inspections and the salary structure. The quality of the person who is in some fundamental sense matched to their work, whose particular combination of temperament and skill and circumstance has placed them in precisely the position where their capacities are fully engaged and their effort is fully consequential. The keeper tended the light because ships needed guidance, and the coast was dangerous, and he was the person positioned to provide that guidance. This is simple. It is almost too simple to say. And yet the simplicity of it contains something that repays attention, because the simplicity is of a particular kind. The simplicity that results from the alignment of work and purpose and person into a coherent whole, rather than the simplicity of a thing that has never been complex. The keeper's dedication was not simple because the keeper was simple. It was simple because decades of the work had clarified what was important and what was not, had worn away the surfaces of contingency and preference to expose the underlying structure of what the work required and why it mattered. What it required was presence. Not presence in the thin modern sense of physical attendance, the body at the assigned location during the assigned hours, presence in a deeper sense, full attention continuously maintained over the years of the posting. The kind of presence that the contemplative traditions of various religions have described using their specific vocabularies, and that the secular world has a harder time naming, because it tends to associate presence of this quality with religious practice, rather than with the keeping of a light. But the lighthouse keeper's presence at his station was a form of dedicated attention that those traditions would have recognized as something more than mere professionalism. It was the practice of attending night after night to the same lamp in the same tower with full awareness of the specific weight of each night's responsibility and not becoming dulled to that weight by its repetition, not retreating into the mechanical execution of a routine in order to avoid the vulnerability of caring whether each night's work was done well. The keepers who served longest and best were those who never entirely achieved the insulation of indifference, who continued after 10 years and 20 years to feel the weather of a bad night as a personal challenge rather than as a merely mechanical condition to be responded to by a trained procedure, who continued to hear in the fog signal's voice not just the sound of a machine operating but the specific intention behind it, the ships it was reaching toward, the captains it was guiding, the cargo and the lives that its reliability protected. There is a concept in the history of craftsmanship, found in different forms in different traditions, from the Japanese notion of shokunin to the European guild system's ideal of mastery of the craftsman who has so thoroughly internalized the standards of the work that the standards no longer exist as external impositions but as internal commitments, natural and as non-negotiable as the requirements of one's own conscience. The lighthouse keeper at his best was this craftsman. The Lighthouse Board's regulations were the external expression of standards that the dedicated keeper had already arrived at independently through his own understanding of what the work required. He polished the lens because the lens needed to be polished. He trimmed the wick because the wick needed to be trimmed. He maintained the logbook with care because the record needed to be accurate and complete, not because the inspector was coming and would check, though the inspector was coming and would check, but because the ships were coming and needed the light. What remains of this now? Not the lighthouses themselves, many of which still stand, many of which still operate. their automation a product of the same rationalization of labor that the 20th century applied to every human task it could reduce to a mechanical operation. Not the technology of the lamp, which has moved through electricity and onto LEDs and solar power and remote monitoring systems of a sophistication that the keeper of the 1850s would have found incomprehensible. Not the organizational structure of the Lighthouse Board, which was reorganized and absorbed into the Coast Guard in 1939. The keepers it had employed gradually replaced by the automated systems that required no human presence, no logbook, no winding of the clockwork weights. What remains is the record, the logbooks where they survive, the correspondence, the inspectors' reports, the built fabric of the lighthouses themselves where they have been preserved, the worn iron stairs, the lens still in some towers though dark now retired into museum status, the marks on the stairwell walls, the worn threshold where 1,000 mornings of booted feet have recorded themselves in the stone. And the legacy of the service itself, which is not visible in any archive, but which exists in the navigational safety of a coastline that was served by dedicated keepers through the century of its greatest maritime activity. The years when the coast of New England was thick with commercial shipping and the lights that lined it were the difference between safe passage and disaster on a weekly basis. He served. The ships passed safely. The light turned in the darkness. This is legacy enough. It would be a failure of this telling to pass through the life of the lighthouse keeper attending only to its large structures, the tower, the lens, the service, the sea, without pausing to acknowledge the small things, the very small things, the things that fall below the threshold of official record and historical significance, and that constitute, in the lived reality of any life, the majority of its actual texture. Morning in early September, the fog has lifted. The keeper has completed his morning work, lens cleaned, brass polished, logbook updated, oil measured and recorded. It is now perhaps 8 in the morning, and the quality of the light on the water is extraordinary, low, golden, rich, with the particular amber warmth of early September sun, at a latitude where summer's warmth has not yet departed, but the angle of the sun has begun its autumnal descent, so that the light comes in at a lower angle than in July and strikes the surfaces of things, the sea, the granite rocks, the clapboard siding of the house, with an oblique, revealing quality that makes everything more itself than it ordinarily appears. The shadow of the lighthouse tower falls long and precise across the short grass of the headland, its edge sharp enough to step across as though crossing a border from one country to another. The keeper sits on the step outside the kitchen door. He has a cup of tea in his hand. The cup is the heavy stoneware one, and it is warm against his palm in the morning air, which has not yet shed the night's chill. He is not doing anything in particular. He is sitting in the sun on the step outside his kitchen door, drinking his tea and looking at the sea, which this morning is as close to still as the Atlantic gets. A long, gentle swell rolling in from the southeast, lifting and lowering the surface with the slow, breathing rhythm of something alive, each swell moving the light on the water in a continuous subtle animation that is too gradual to identify as movement, but which means that no 2 consecutive seconds of looking at the water are exactly alike. Herring gull stands on the topmost point of the granite ledge below the headland, perfectly still, facing into what little wind there is, its white plumage exactly the colour of the lighthouse tower in the morning light. It remains motionless for a very long time, long enough that the keeper notices it and watches it and begins to feel that the gull is performing some specific act of stillness, some deliberate practice of presence. Though he knows this is projection, that the gull is simply doing what gulls do, which is to stand on high points and assess the available information. Nevertheless, the gull and the tower and the light on the water and the cup of warm tea in his hand and the particular quality of this September morning, these things have arranged themselves into something that the keeper feels as beauty, as the specific grace of ordinary things in the right light. He does not probably have the word mindfulness. The 19th century did not use it in the way we have come to use it, as the name of a practice, a technique, a corrective applied to the chronic distraction of modern existence. He simply sits on his step and drinks his tea and notices things. The shadow of the tower on the grass, the gull on the ledge, the slow swell on the water. The smell of the kitchen behind him, wood smoke and the last trace of breakfast, and the smell of the sea ahead of him, salt and cold, and the faint green note of the exposed tide line at the base of the headland, where the low tide has recently retreated and left its usual careful catalogue of washed things. This is the thing about small pleasures in a life organised around a serious and demanding vocation. They are tasted completely. The keeper's cup of tea on the kitchen step is not a distraction from important work or a fragment of leisure squeezed between obligations. It is a proper pause, a defined portion of the morning's architecture, and it is inhabited fully because the keeper has learned through the practice of attention that the work itself teaches to inhabit each portion of time fully rather than to be always partially present in the current moment and partially elsewhere, in the moment just past or the one coming. The small beauties of the lighthouse keeper's world were not few, they were in fact extraordinarily numerous, available in such abundance that the only requirement for appreciating them was the willingness to look. The tide pool on the southern ledge that held in the right afternoon light the exact colour of the sky above it, a deep coastal blue captured in 6 inches of water and framed in barnacled granite, the frost patterns on the inside of the lantern-room glass on very cold nights, elaborate crystalline structures of such geometric intricacy that they looked designed, intentional, as though the winter air had been practising architecture on the glass while the keeper slept. The sound of the first spring peepers from the marshy area at the base of the hill on the mainland side of the neck, heard from the kitchen window on the first truly warm evening of April, sound so specific and so welcome after the long silent winter that it produced in the keeper something very close to physical relief. The colour of lichen on the granite rocks of the headland, a word deserving more than a word because lichen on granite is not one colour but many, arranged in overlapping territories of their own biological competition, the pale grey-green of parmelia, flat and matte and slightly crinkled at its edges, the bright, almost luminous yellow-green of rhizocarpon, covering the rock in irregular patches that make the stone look as though it has been dappled by a light, filtering through leaves that are not there, the deep rust-orange of xanthoria, the most dramatic of the coastal lichens, growing in circular colonies that slowly expand their territory across the rock face at rates too slow to observe, but not too slow to measure, each colony a record of decades of patient biological persistence. The keeper learned the lichens' names from a natural history volume sent to him by his brother-in-law, who worked in a bookseller's shop in Boston and occasionally sent items he thought might interest a man living in an unusual relationship with the natural world. The book was old, and the information in it was sometimes inaccurate by the advancing standards of 19th-century botany and natural philosophy, but the keeper read it with genuine interest, and thereafter regarded the lichens on the rocks of his headland with the particular additional pleasure of the named, the way that knowing what to call something changes one's relationship with it, makes it more present, gives one's attention more to hold on to. He knew his lichens. He knew his tide pools. He knew the names of the stars above his lantern-room and the names of the navigational hazards off his coast, and the names of the captains who passed in the ships whose running lights he watched through the nights of his posting. He knew the name of the gull that stood most mornings on the highest point of the south ledge. He had named it himself. The bird was, almost certainly, not the same bird from year to year, but the habit was the same bird, the pattern was the same, and in the keeper's understanding of the world, the pattern was what deserved the name. He called it patience. Let us stay here for a while in the country of reflection, where the historical facts have done their work of grounding us in a particular time and place, and where now the particular time and place can be used as a lens through which to see something more general, something that the lighthouse keeper's life illuminates as all particular lives, examined with sufficient attention, illuminate about the nature of human existence in its most universal dimensions. The lighthouse is a structure built at the boundary, not at the safe centre, not deep inland where the conditions are mild and the ground is stable, and the surrounding civilization provides 1,000 forms of insulation against the rawness of the world at the edge. At the point where the organized human world of harbors and farms and roads and institutions meets the disorganized non-human world of deep water and weather and geological time, the lighthouse does not turn its back on that boundary. It inhabits it, announces it, makes it the specific location of its purpose. The lighthouse says, here is where the land ends, here is the edge, and here at the edge is a light. There is something in this that the 19th century's more theologically inclined citizens would have recognized immediately as an allegory, and they were not wrong to recognize it, because allegory is not imposed on the lighthouse from outside, it is intrinsic to its situation. The idea of a single light at the boundary of the known world, burning through the darkness to guide those who are lost toward safety. This is not just the functional description of a coastal navigation aid. It is one of the oldest shapes of human meaning-making, recurring in religious traditions and literary traditions and the spontaneous mythologies of cultures that never encountered each other, because it describes something so fundamental to the human situation that every culture arrives at it independently. The darkness is real, and the light matters, and the question of who tends the light, and at what cost, and for whom, among the most serious questions available to a conscious mind. The keeper who spent his life at the boundary was not, however, a symbolic figure to himself. He was a practical man with a lamp to tend and a logbook to maintain, and a family to feed and winters to survive. The allegory was not something he carried consciously. It was something he lived, which is a different relationship with meaning, deeper and more thoroughly inhabited and less available to the critical distance that conscious allegory making requires. He did not think of himself as a figure of light. He thought of himself as the person responsible for making sure the light was bright and reliable and turned at the correct rate so that the ships could find their way along the coast. But the life he lived in the service of that light had the shape of something more than its practical dimensions. Consider the element of solitude. Not the solitude of abandonment or rejection, not the solitude that descends on a person when the world has left them behind, but the solitude of chosen position, of vocation, of being the person who stays at the post when others have gone home. The keeper's nighttime solitude, the solitude of the lantern room at 2 a.m. with the sea moving in the darkness beyond the glass and the clockwork ticking and the lamp turning its faithful circle, was the solitude of responsibility inhabited alone. This is a particular kind of solitude that those who have experienced it know as one of the most clarifying conditions available to a human consciousness. To be alone with a task that matters, in a place that makes the mattering of the task evident, with no company except the work itself and the awareness of what the work serves. It is in this solitude that the self becomes most precisely itself, stripped of the social performances that the presence of others always requires, stripped of the self-consciousness that comes with being observed, traduced to the essential relationship between the person and the work, and the purpose the work serves. The keeper in the lantern room at 2 a.m. was not performing lighthouse keeping, he was keeping the light. The distinction sounds trivial and is not trivial at all. Performance requires an audience. The work at 2 a.m. had no audience, only the sea, and the ships on the sea who would never know who had polished the lens and wound the clockwork and held the watch through the cold night, who would only know that the light was there when they needed it. This anonymity of service is worth dwelling on. The keeper knew the captains who passed, some of them knew his name, but the vast majority of the ships that passed his light in the years of his posting did so without knowing who had made the light possible. And the captains who navigated by it understood it as a fixed fact of the coast rather than as the product of a specific person's daily labour. The keeper's contribution to the safety of the coast was real and large and almost entirely invisible, built into the infrastructure of navigation as a given rather than attributed as a gift. He accepted this invisibility. The work did not require recognition to be worth doing. The light did not need applause to justify its burning. This acceptance of consequential anonymity is perhaps the keeper's most profound teaching for those of us living in a cultural moment that tends to associate meaning with visibility, contribution with recognition, Life well lived, with a life that has been adequately witnessed and recorded and responded to by an audience. The keeper suggests from the distance of his century and a half that meaning does not require an audience. That a life organized around a clear purpose and executed with consistent care is sufficient, is in fact precisely what a good life consists of. Regardless of whether the culture of the moment chooses to mark it with any of the forms of recognition that the culture has available for deployment. He lit the lamp at dusk. He tended it through the night. He extinguished it at dawn. He cleaned the lens and polished the brass and trimmed the wick and wound the clockwork and made his breakfast and wrote in his logbook and went about the business of his day. And in the night the ships passed safely, guided by the light he had made. And in the logbook, then the patient brown handwriting that describes the night's conditions in factual, unhurried sentences, there is no record of heroism, no record of triumph, no record of anyone's gratitude. Only the date, the time, the weather, the sea state, the visibility, the lamp status. Lit at 7:14 p.m, extinguished at 5:38 a.m, all well. All well. Two words that carry their quiet completeness, the entire weight of a life lived at the edge of the darkness, holding the light steady. All well. The afternoon is ending now. You can feel it in the quality of the light, the way it has softened from the bright, direct light of midday into something warmer and more oblique, a honeyed amber that falls across the headland at a low angle and makes the shadows of every small thing long and interesting. The shadow of the flagpole, the shadow of the fence posts along the kitchen garden, the shadow of the lighthouse tower itself, stretching far across the grass of the headland in a long, dark stripe, pointing inland, pointing away from the sea, as though even the tower's shadow is trying to rest after the long, bright hours of standing exposed. The keeper has finished the afternoon's tasks. The oil stores have been checked for the last time today. The level confirmed adequate for tonight's burning. The clockwork mechanism has been wound in the late afternoon winding that will carry it through the first hours of the night's operation. The lens has been examined one final time, tilted in the low afternoon light that comes in through the lantern room glass at this hour in a wide, warm band that is particularly good for revealing any streaks or deposits on the prisms that the morning's cleaning might have missed. Everything is clean, everything is ready. He comes down the iron staircase for what will be the last time before the evening lighting. His footsteps on the grating are unhurried, descending rather than climbing, so that gravity participates in the movement, and the body descends with a gentle forward-leaning ease, rather than the deliberate effort of ascent. His hand trails along the central column, feeling its coolness through the palm, feeling the slight roughness of the painted iron against the skin of his fingers. The stairwell smells of lamp oil and cool stone, and the faint fading tang of the vinegar solution from the morning's cleaning. He passes through the neck and into the kitchen. His wife is at the fire. She is stirring something, a pot suspended on the crane hook over the low coals, its contents giving off a steam that rises and spreads in the warm air of the kitchen in translucent sheets, carrying with it the smell of salt pork and onions and the deep, savoury complexity of something that has been cooking for several hours and has reached the stage where the individual ingredients have surrendered their separate identities and become collectively something new. The smell fills the kitchen and moves through the doorway toward the rest of the house, a slow advance of warmth and comfort into the cooling early evening air. He sits at the kitchen table. The cup of tea appears before him with the particular efficiency of a household that has run along the same tracks for many years, not placed before him with ceremony or comment, but simply there warm the tea, a deep amber in the thick cup, coil of steam rising from it and dissolving into the kitchen air above the table. He wraps both hands around the cup and holds it, feeling its warmth move into his palms and spread up through his fingers and into his wrists. That particular comfort of warm hands in a cooling world. Outside the kitchen window, the light is changing. The amber has deepened, the sky above the headland, visible through the glass in a long horizontal band above the sill, has moved from the bright blue of the afternoon into the richer, darker blue of the early evening, and in the west, visible only as a reflection in the glass, warm glow caught in the lower edge of the pane, the sun is approaching the hills of the mainland, beginning its final descent toward the horizon, that will mark the transition from day to night, and from the keeper's resting hours to the keeper's working hours. Not yet. Not yet, but soon. The children are somewhere behind him, their voices audible from the room above, the soft percussion of their feet on the wide plank floor, the sounds of 2 or 3 young human beings engaged in whatever the particular business of this particular evening is. Their voices have the particular quality of voices heard through a floor. Muffled, warmed, stripped of their upper frequencies by the wood between, so that what comes through is the pure melody of the sounds without the consonant edges, something like music rather than language, the sound of children being alive and indoors and warm. He drinks his tea slowly. The pot on the fire simmers, the coals breathe, the clock on the mantelpiece in the parlour, a small brass-faced instrument that the keeper winds every Sunday after church, produces its patient, measured tick, each one small and dry and completely regular, dividing the silence of the kitchen evening into its equal portions with the reliability of something that has been designed for exactly this purpose and has no other ambition. The light in the west is lower now. He can feel the approaching dusk not only in the light but in some less definable register, a change in the quality of the air perhaps, or in the sound of the sea below the headland, which at this hour seems to deepen slightly, take on an additional resonance as the temperature gradient between the water and the cooling evening air shifts, and the sound travels differently. He has felt this shift for so many evenings across so many years that it has become as much a physical sensation as an observation, the transition from day to the working night arriving as a slight but distinct change in the texture of the world. He finishes his tea. He sets the cup down on the table. Then the sound it makes, the soft, dense sound of stoneware on pine, barely audible, completely comfortable, is one of the small, definitive sounds of this household. Characteristic and as identifying as a signature, he stands. He puts on his coat, the heavy wool one, not the oilskin, because the evening is still, the wind having dropped in the late afternoon to a gentle onshore movement that carries the smell of the sea but nothing more demanding. He takes the matches from their box on the shelf beside the kitchen door, the long-stemmed kind, the phosphorus matches that light with a single stroke against the rough surface of the striking board, their sulphurous snap brief and bright, and followed immediately by the steadier, softer flame that will light the lamp. He pauses for a moment at the kitchen door. His wife looks up from the fire, their eyes meet across the kitchen, across the table, and the lingering smell of the tea and the steam from the pot and the lamplight that has been lit in the kitchen now that the day's natural light is no longer sufficient. And in that meeting of eyes is the entire economy of a long domestic partnership, the communication of departure, the communication of understood necessity, the communication of something warmer and more particular that belongs to them alone, and has no public name. He goes through the neck to the tower. He climbs the iron staircase, the matches in his pocket, the evening sounds of the coast rising through the stone walls around him, the sea and the last birds, and the distant moan of a vessel's horn far out on the darkening water, vessel seeking its berth before the night closes fully around it. He opens the trap-door. He steps into the lantern room. The last light in the west, the deep copper and rose of the final moments before sunset, colour that has no name sufficient to it, spreads across the surface of the sea below him and turns the water briefly, impossibly beautiful. He sees it. He takes a breath. And then he draws back the curtain from the lens, and he lights the lamp. And the light begins to turn. The night has come. It has come softly, the way it always comes on calm evenings along this coast, not as a sudden falling of darkness, but as a gradual deepening of the blue, a slow withdrawal of colour from the world that begins at the horizon and moves upward through the sky in gentle increments, so that there is never quite a moment when one could say, now it is night. There is only the continuous, patient dimming of things, the sea going from grey to dark grey to the deep blue-black of a body of water that is no longer reflecting the sky, but is simply itself dark and cold and moving, as it has always moved, as it will always move, whether or not there is anyone standing at the top of a white tower watching it. But there is someone, and the light is turning. You can feel it from where you are, that steady rhythm, that patient revolution of the lens, sending its beam across the dark surface of the water in a long, sweeping arc that completes itself every few seconds, and then begins again and again and again. If you were on a ship somewhere out on the Gulf of Maine, the beam would reach you as a flash, a brief, warm brightness in the darkness ahead, and then the darkness again, and then the brightness again. And in the regularity of that rhythm there would be everything you needed, your position, your distance from the coast, your safety or your danger, all of it encoded in the simple language of light and interval that the lighthouse speaks to the sea. From here, from the warm side of the story, from the side of the house and the fire and the heavy quilts and the stoneware cup drying on the rack beside the dry sink, the light is a different thing. It is not a navigational signal. It is a presence. Familiar, reliable presence at the edge of the world, turning its circle through the dark hours with the fidelity of something that has made a promise and is keeping it. The keeper is in the lantern room now. He stands at the glass, his hands resting lightly on the railing, his breath creating the faintest mist on the cold pane closest to him, a small oval of condensed breath that appears and fades with each exhalation. Tiny private weather pattern produced by the warmth of a human body in a cold glass room, present for a moment and then gone, present and then gone. He scans the horizon. His eyes move from south to east to north in the slow, practiced arc of the watch, lingering at the areas of potential hazard, the ledge to the southeast where a ship pushing too close to the coast might find the bottom before finding deep water, the passage between the outer islands where the tidal current runs strong, and the chart warns of irregular depths. Everything he sees is orderly, the running lights of a distant vessel moving northeast, keeping its proper distance from the coast, behaving as it should. The reflection of the stars on the water, those long wavering reflections that appear between the larger swells and are gone when the swells lift the surface and break the reflection into fragments of light. He is satisfied. He winds the clockwork, feeling the familiar resistance of the mechanism taking up the weights, the crank turning with its smooth, weighted solidity that has become over the years one of the most purely pleasant physical sensations he knows, useful effort, immediately translated into stored energy, immediately translated into continued motion of the lamp above him. He wins until the weights are fully raised. He settles them with the gentle precision of long practice. The lens continues its turning unchanged, unaware of the human attention and the human effort that make its turning possible. He goes down the iron staircase, through the neck into the kitchen. The house is quiet now. The fire has burned down to coals. The kitchen still holds its warmth from the evening's cooking, but the warmth is softer now, less insistent. The kind of warmth that is the memory of heat rather than the thing itself. The smell of the supper is still in the air, fainter, mixed now with the smell of the cooling house and the distant, ever-present smell of the sea that the house has absorbed over the decades of its exposure until it is inseparable from the wood of the walls and the fabric of the curtains and the very air that moves through the rooms. He banks the fire. This is the last domestic task of the day, the careful arrangement of the coals and ash that will preserve the fire's life through the cold hours of the night, banking the glowing coals with a layer of ash to slow their burning, leaving just enough access to air that the coals will remain alive without burning through before morning. He does this with the iron poker and the ash shovel, the movements as habitual and as thoughtful as everything else he does. The banked fire a small, careful act of provision for tomorrow, courtesy extended from this version of himself to the version who will stand here in the darkness of 4 a.m. and need to find coals rather than dead ash. He climbs the stairs. The bedroom is dark, lit only by the indirect suggestion of the lighthouse beam as it sweeps past the window. A very faint, brief brightening of the room every few seconds, as rhythmic and as gentle as the breathing of a sleeping person. His wife is already asleep, her breathing slow and steady under the heavy quilts, one arm curved on the pillow in the relaxed arc of deep sleep. He undresses in the dark, each movement slow and quiet, the practiced quiet of a person who has come to bed after her for many years and has learned to minimize his intrusion on her sleep with the same consideration he applies to every repetitive task that affects someone else's well-being. He lies down. The quilts settle around him with the soft, heavy warmth of many layers, the accumulated heat of his wife's sleep warmth on her side of the bed meeting the cooler air that has pooled on his side while he was away, and the meeting of these temperatures is immediately, completely comfortable, the kind of physical comfort that is so simple and so total, that it requires no analysis, only reception. He is warm. The house is quiet. Outside, the sea moves with its ancient patience, the waves lifting and settling against the ledges below the headland in their slow, continuous rhythm, a sound that has been part of this place since before the lighthouse, since before the first people who stood on this headland and watched the water, since before the granite of the headland cooled from its original fire into the dense grey permanence it wears now. The lighthouse beam sweeps past the window. Once. Brief softening of the darkness. A warm, timbre suggestion of light crossing the ceiling above the bed. And then darkness again. And the sea. And the slow breathing of the sleeping house. And the beam comes again, steady, faithful, patient, tracing its quiet circle through the dark hours as it has through so many dark hours before this one. It will through so many dark hours yet to come. You are warm. You are safe. The light is turning. The keeper is here. The sea is breathing beyond the walls, and the fire is banked against the morning, and the clock on the parlour mantelpiece is dividing the silence into its equal, patient portions. Then there is nothing you need to attend to now, nothing you need to watch over, nothing you need to hold. The lens catches the light. The beam sweeps south. The sea receives it. And somewhere, the Protestant in the dark water, ship finds its way home. Let yourself go now, gently. The light is still turning. The light is still turning. The light is still turning. And the night holds everything in its soft, dark hands, and the coast breathes, and the stars move their slow arc above the tower, and the keeper watches, and the lamp burns, and the world is quiet, and all is well, and all is well, and all is very, very gently, completely, permanently well. Good night. Welcome to Sleepy History with Henry. Here, we harness AI to breathe new life into authentic historical records, creating an immersive auditory experience. This entire production is AI-assisted, crafted solely for relaxation and sleep support. TAND is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Please do not listen while driving or operating machinery. Now, let Henry and AI guide you on a peaceful journey through the past.